On March 14, 2017, the quiet city of Puebla, Mexico, experienced a wake-up call that would never be forgotten. It was an ordinary morning, with businesses opening their doors, children in uniforms heading to school, mothers rushing to buy fresh bread at the bakeries. But it only took a few minutes for the sound of news broadcasts, cell phone rings, and shouts in the streets to announce a revelation that paralyzed the heart of the entire community. What, until then, seemed like just another rumor, took concrete form. Dozens of children who had been missing for years had been found. Names that had been nearly erased from the collective memory, yellowed photographs tacked to lampposts, posters that blended into the urban landscape without attracting further attention. Suddenly, it all came to life again. Those children weren't just forgotten faces. They were alive. And the place where they were found took even the most skeptical breath away. The first reports arrived in fragments, inconsistent as always happens in moments of shock. Some said there were 20 children, others 50, until the official number finally emerged: 80. 80 innocent little ones rescued from a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. And believe me, even the most experienced reporters had difficulty describing what they saw. They spoke of an underground hideout, a space hidden beneath tons of concrete, cold, stuffy, damp, where no child should ever have been. That revelation struck like a sharp blow to the collective conscience. How was it possible that so many lives had been ripped from society and locked away in absolute silence for so long without anyone noticing? The impact was immediate. Mothers who had lost hope rushed to hospitals, trying to find out if their children were among those rescued. Authorities were pressured by journalists, and the population itself crowded in front of the police station building to try to extract information. The entire country was plunged into a mixture of relief and outrage. Relief because the children were alive, but outrage because no one could understand how this had been possible for so many years. Puebla, which until then had been just another city in the Mexican countryside, became the center of global attention. International channels broadcast live, headlines carried photos of still terrified faces, and experts tried, without much success, to explain the inexplicable. But as everyone stared at the numbers, the rescue details, and the shocking leaked footage, there was something even more disturbing behind the discovery, because amid all the confusion, a question echoed, unsettling, with no immediate answer. Who had been capable of organizing something so monstrous, and how could it all have remained hidden for so many years, right in front of everyone's eyes? Stories like this stir us deep down, don't they? Because they're not just cold tales. They're lives interrupted, hidden secrets, mysteries that for too long remained hidden until they explode before our eyes with chilling force. Those who have followed this far aren't just anyone. They're people who feel, who are involved, who resonate with each twist and turn, and who understand the weight of giving voice to stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. Here, we don't let silence prevail. Here, each disappearance is told as it truly was, with all the pain, suspense, and hope it deserves. This space is made for those who believe that stories like this need to be remembered and shared. So let's join this community that never looks away, that faces the mystery until the end. Hit the subscribe button now, like this video, and come be part of this journey where every detail matters. Back then, when the case of the 80 children began to gain prominence, few people imagined that behind all that movement lay a woman carrying enormous personal pain, an open wound that had never healed. Her name was Lucia Ramirez. At 42, Lucia was no longer the same woman she had been years before. A devoted mother, an elementary school teacher, one of those people who was always involved in community activities, organizing school fairs and helping neighbors with simple everyday problems. Those who knew her before 2014 said she had an easy smile, the kind that lit up any room. But everything changed the day her daughter, Camilla, disappeared. Camilla was only 11 years old when she left school and never returned home. It was as if the ground had swallowed her. There was no ransom note, no concrete clues, just a desperate silence. Lucia spent days, weeks, months knocking on doors, begging for help, trying to understand where she had gone wrong when her daughter had been ripped from her arms. And what hurt even more was the coldness of the authorities, who quickly classified the disappearance as a voluntary escape, insinuating that perhaps Camilla had left of her own free will. This tore Lucia apart. How could she accept that a girl who still slept with her favorite teddy bear could simply decide to abandon her family? It made no sense. But for the police, the case was closed. And it was at this point that Lucia's transformation began. With each closed door, each disbelieving look, she became more determined. What was once an ordinary woman with a simple and peaceful routine gave way to someone driven by a silent obsession. Lucia began investigating on her own, collecting newspaper clippings and keeping testimonies from witnesses who had never been heard, while friends and even family told her it was time to accept it, that Camilla would probably never return. Lucia refused to give up. She believed with all her strength that her daughter was still alive. In the years that followed, Lucia became an uncomfortable figure. In the community, some saw her as an example of strength, others as a troubled woman unable to move on. She no longer attended family parties or attended church as she once did. Her life revolved around chasing leads, retracing routes, and revisiting places she believed Camilla might have been. She even lost her teaching job because she spent more time searching through police files and visiting dangerous neighborhoods than in the classroom. But deep down, for Lucia, none of that mattered. What mattered was finding answers. And it was in this constant state of searching that Lucia began to notice patterns no one else saw. In 2015, she came across information that other girls had disappeared under similar circumstances in the Puebla region and neighboring cities. They were all close in age, between 8 and 12. In some instances, witnesses reported the sight of a white van driving near schools. This detail, initially dismissed as irrelevant by the police, set off a red flag in Lucia. She saved every report, noted every coincidence, and over the course of 2 years, built a mural in her own home, filled with photos, red lines, connecting faces, dates, and places. It was as if she were putting together a puzzle only she could see. The problem was that, as Lucia sank deeper and deeper into this solitary investigation, life around her continued. Her friends drifted away, her husband couldn't handle the pressure and eventually left. Neighbors whispered about the crazy woman who couldn't get over her loss. But even alone, Lucia remained steadfast. And that's where the most impressive part comes in, that obsession, which seemed like nothing more than the desperate act of a distraught mother, turned out to be the key to something much bigger. Because, when no one else believed it, Lucia was about to find a loose thread that would unravel an unimaginable mystery. She didn't know it yet, but her personal pain was directly linked to the secret that would shock the world. The 80 children who would be rescued in 2017 weren't as far removed from Camilla's story as everyone imagined. And every clue Lucia collected, every detail she didn't let go unnoticed, brought her closer to the truth that had been hidden from view for so long. Fate was about to place before her something that would change not only her life, but the lives of hundreds of families marked by the same desperate silence. In November 2016, almost 3 years after Camilla's disappearance, something happened in Puebla that seemed at first glance just another scare, another failed kidnapping attempt that would soon be forgotten. But for Lucia, it was like a flash of light in the darkness. That morning, a boy named Mateo, just 9 years old, was returning from school when a man tried to lure him into a white van parked near the gate. Matteo later said the man offered him candy and said he needed help carrying some boxes, those common traps adults use to deceive innocent children. But unlike the other victims, Matteo managed to escape. He ran to a small grocery store on the corner, screaming for help, and it was the description he gave. The police that would change everything. According to the report, there was a strange symbol on the van's dashboard, a kind of engraved mark, a detail that might have gone unnoticed, but that stuck with Lucia when she read the report. This same symbol had been mentioned in previous reports from families whose children had disappeared. It was as if it were the silent signature of someone acting in the shadows, always with the same coldness, repeating a pattern invisible to the authorities. But Lucia didn't miss a thing. While the police treated Matteo's case as an isolated incident, another failed attempt, she realized she was onto a crucial link. At that moment, she went back to reviewing all the records she had accumulated at home. Newspaper clippings, police reports, handwritten notes with information from forgotten witnesses, everything was placed side by side, and it was then that a disturbing pattern began to emerge before her eyes. The same white van had been seen in at least 6 of the disappearances she had been investigating, always near schools, always driving at similar times, always leaving behind an inexplicable void. But that wasn't all. Lucia also noticed that the reports had strangely similar details, as if the stories repeated themselves with slight variations. Some said the driver was a tall man with dark hair, others spoke of a shorter man wearing a cap, but the vehicle was always present. And there was one more detail that left her cold. In at least 2 cases, neighbors reported hearing muffled cries coming from inside the van, but when they called the police, they were ignored, claiming it was just the sound of children playing. For Lucia, this was no coincidence. It couldn't be. She began making maps, tracing lines, connecting disappearance sites, cross-referencing timetables, comparing descriptions. Alone in her living room, surrounded by papers, she saw what no one else wanted to see. There was a clear pattern, and someone was taking those children in an organized, methodical way, as if following a larger plan. But when she decided to take her conclusions to the authorities again, she was met with the same disbelief as always. The police chief barely glanced at the papers she carried. He said there wasn't enough evidence, that the information was vague, that Matteo's case couldn't be compared to the others. To them, it was all just a tragic coincidence. But something inside Lucia told her it wasn't a coincidence. It was the same cold, calculating hand at work again. This frustration might have made anyone give up, but Lucia didn't work that way. On the contrary, the police's rejection only strengthened her resolve. She returned home that night, closed the curtains, and spent hours staring at the connection board she'd put up on the wall. Each red line connecting one disappearance to another seemed to pulse before her eyes. She knew she was close to uncovering something important, but the central piece was still missing, the one detail that would reveal the full extent of what was happening. And although she still wasn't entirely clear, there was something about Matteo's description that stuck in her mind. That symbol engraved on the van's dashboard couldn't be a simple aesthetic detail, a mere ornament. It was the mark of someone who wanted to be remembered, who left a mark almost like a challenge, as if to say, "I'm here, but you can't catch me." This thought tormented her, kept her awake at night, and made her mentally revisit every statement, every story. Who owned that van? Why did he always use the same vehicle? And most importantly, where was he taking those children? These questions wouldn't leave her alone, and perhaps most disturbing was the realization that, even after so many years, no one but her seemed truly determined to find the answers. And it was precisely this sense of isolation, mixed with an obsession with details no one else noticed, that pushed her even deeper into this solitary quest, a quest that, unbeknownst to Lucia, was about to reveal something much darker than anyone could have imagined. Lucia was tired of hearing the same phrase, There's no connection between the cases. It was as if each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, a cruel stroke of bad luck, but never part of something larger. But inside her, everything screamed otherwise. And it was with this insistence that, reviewing her clippings and notes once again, she began to see what she called a hidden pattern. It was like pieces of a gigantic puzzle, finally starting to fit together. She opened boxes of papers she kept in the living room closet and spread them out on the floor. Every newspaper clipping, every police report, every note taken during meetings with victims' families was there before her. And this time, instead of looking at each case individually, she decided to connect the dots. She took out a large map of the Puebla region and began marking with colored pens the exact locations where each child had disappeared. Little by little, red lines began to appear, connecting the marks. The result made Lucia's heart race. The disappearances weren't scattered randomly, as they always said. They formed a route, a path that seemed to follow its own logic. As she cross-referenced the dates, she noticed something even stranger. The disappearances occurred at almost regular intervals, always a few months apart, and almost always on fair days or school events. It was as if someone had chosen times when there would be more movement, more distraction, and more ease in acting without arousing suspicion. With each new discovery, Lucia felt her breath grow heavier. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone planned, someone calculated, someone executed with almost military precision, and the detail of the white van became even more frightening. Reviewing reports, she realized that the vehicle had been seen not only before some kidnappings, but also days later, driving around the same neighborhoods. It was as if the driver was in no hurry to disappear, as if he felt completely confident that no one would ever link him to the crimes. That cold arrogance revolted her. And then there was the symbol on the dashboard, that detail Mateo had described and that appeared in other vague, often ignored testimonies. Lucia began investigating on her own whether the symbol held any significance. She scoured books, online forums, and even spoke with old friends from university. She discovered it vaguely resembled an emblem used by some clandestine organizations involved in human trafficking. Nothing confirmed, nothing solid, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in her mind. Was she dealing with something bigger than she imagined? Was it not just a single kidnapper, but an organized network with enough resources and contacts to operate for years without being detected? The thought was terrifying, but it made sense. How could she explain 80 children disappearing without a trace for so long? How could she accept that so many families had their lives destroyed without any serious investigation being conducted? Lucia began to believe she was facing not just one criminal, but an entire system that profited from the silence and disappearance of innocent people. This suspicion gnawed at her, yet at the same time gave her even more strength to carry on. But there was a problem. The more connections she made, the more isolated she felt. Authorities ignored her, neighbors called her paranoid, friends distanced themselves. Even family members said she was obsessed, but Lucia didn't care. For her, every red line drawn on the map was proof that she was on the right path. She knew there was something big hidden behind these disappearances, and amidst all this turmoil, Lucia remembered the look on her daughter Camilla's face the last time she saw her leaving her house. That look came back as a painful memory, and at the same time, as fuel to keep going. Because, deep down, she believed that solving this puzzle wasn't just a way to help other families, it was also her only chance to find her own daughter. The pattern was there before her, clear as ever. All that was left was to convince someone to see it. And it was precisely at that point that a new piece began to emerge, one that would completely change the way Lucia approached this solitary struggle. Because, unbeknownst to her, she was about to discover that, behind all, The red lines on her mural, there was a familiar face, a name she never would have imagined connected to all of this. Lucia believed that, after gathering so much evidence, she would finally be able to get the authorities' attention. Armed with her photo wall, transformed into organized folders, detailed maps, and meticulous notes, she decided to seek out the Puebla police once again. She entered the building with her heart racing, clutching her papers to her chest as if they were an extension of her own daughter. She hoped, even though deep down she knew otherwise, that someone would finally pay attention. But what she found was exactly what she'd seen so many times before. Cold stares, bored expressions, canned responses that sounded more like a rehearsal. The police chief listened for a few minutes, then interrupted his explanation and uttered the phrase she hated hearing most. "There's not enough evidence, Ms. Ramirez." Lucia tried to argue, showing him the pattern, the maps, the eyewitness accounts. She said there were too many coincidences, that the van couldn't have been in so many random locations. But he shook his head impatiently and replied that it was all just a figment of his imagination, a desperate attempt by a mother unable to accept her loss. Those words felt like a knife to her heart. It was no longer just carelessness, it was inhumanity. How could they reduce all that effort, all that pain, to a mere illusion? Worst of all was the way the meeting ended. One of the investigators escorted her to the door and, in an almost threatening tone, told her she was getting in the way of real investigations. Real investigations, as if the missing children weren't real, as if the pain of dozens of families were just a distraction. Lucia left with her hands shaking, her eyes burning with rage and helplessness. On the way back, she remembered all the times she'd been disbelieved. She remembered the day she'd reported Camila missing and heard from a police officer that girls her age liked to go on adventures. He remembered the times he'd heard that perhaps it was better to accept reality. And now, once again, the truth that was right in front of them was simply thrown away like trash. This frustration was suffocating, but it also fueled a fire inside her, because if the police wouldn't do anything, she would, even if she had to face it all alone. With each denial, Lucia realized there was something deeper behind the silence. It wasn't just incompetence or neglect. It was almost as if there was a deliberate effort to suppress any connection between the disappearances. This thought haunted her because it meant there might be influential people involved, people with a vested interest in keeping the case buried. The idea of tackling something so big terrified her, but giving up wasn't an option, not when Camilla's life and the lives of so many other children still hung in the balance. That night at home, she looked at the wall. Again. Every line, every photo, every note seemed to scream at her to keep going, and it was there, before that pile of papers taped to the wall, that Lucia made a silent decision. No matter what anyone said, no matter who tried to silence her, she would see it through. She might be alone, she might be exhausted, but she wouldn't stop. This confrontation with the police, painful as it was, served as a turning point. Until then, Lucia had still harbored a glimmer of hope that at some point the authorities would take action. Now, that hope was dead. She knew the real investigation was just beginning, and that it would be up to her to follow the path everyone refused to see. And it was precisely at that moment, when the loneliness seemed heavier than ever, that an unexpected detail began to emerge, something that would open a new door in her search and show her that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she imagined. After that day, she left the police station practically expelled, Lucia felt. There was no turning back. The police not only ignored her, but now treated her like a nuisance, someone who was hindering rather than helping. It was at that moment that she made the decision that would change everything. If no one wanted to investigate, she would do it herself, no matter the cost. And for the first time, she spoke out loud, alone, in the silence of her office. "I will find out the truth, even if it's the last thing I do." That sentence echoed in her mind like an oath. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew she was picking a fight that could further destroy her life, but she also knew she'd already lost too much to back down. There was no more job, no more marriage, and even her relationship with part of her family was frayed. All that remained was her missing daughter, the emptiness at the dinner table, the room with untouched toys waiting for someone who would never return. This emptiness was the fuel that drove her forward. Lucia began to structure her own investigation with the seriousness of someone with no other choice. She revisited sites of old disappearances, walked the streets where witnesses claimed to have seen the white van, entered vacant lots, and spoke with people who had never been officially interviewed. She carried a notebook with her where she wrote down every detail, times, sounds, clothing, even smells that residents claimed to have noticed near certain areas. It was like putting together an invisible puzzle, piece by piece, with information that seemed too small to matter, but which, when put together, formed a disturbing image. But this decision also carried risks. Lucia realized she was being followed within days. Sometimes, walking home, she could hear the headlights of a car following her steps. Other times, she received silent phone calls, just heavy breathing on the other end. At first, she thought it was paranoia caused by stress, but then it became clear that someone didn't want her to continue. This only strengthened her conviction that there was a much larger network behind it all. Because after all, if it were just the imagination of a desperate mother, why would it bother her so much? And it didn't stop there. Lucia also began losing people close to her. Friends who had previously supported her began to distance themselves, citing fear of reprisals. Some neighbors openly said she was obsessed, that she was digging her own grave. But as painful as it was to carry this burden alone, there was something inside her that wouldn't let her give up. She had seen the pattern, had connected data no one else wanted to see, and felt she was getting closer and closer to something crucial. The emotional toll was devastating. There were nights when she simply broke down, crying herself to sleep, hugging her daughter's pillow, breathing in the scent still lingering in her childhood. But the next day, she would get up, make coffee, and start again. It was a routine of fighting exhaustion, loneliness, and an invisible enemy. She clung to the idea that each step forward could mean saving not only her daughter, but many other children as well. And it was precisely during this period, when she seemed to be fighting against the entire world without any support, that Lucia felt she was reaching her limit. It was no longer just a matter of persistence, but of survival. With each new move, with each clue she found, she felt she was touching something bigger than she could control. And yet she didn't stop, because the doubt that tormented her, the question that never left her mind, was the same every night before she closed her eyes. How far would she have to go to finally be heard? And the answer, though she didn't know it yet, was about to appear, just not in the way I expected. As the months passed, Lucia's solitary investigation began to take a heavy toll. With each new attempt to follow leads, she lost a piece of her own life. The money she had saved was consumed by trips to neighboring cities, payments to informants, and copies of documents she obtained with great persistence. Unemployed, living off small temporary jobs, she could no longer maintain the same routine. The refrigerator grew increasingly empty, bills piled up on the table, and the phone rang with charges she simply could not pay. But more painful than the financial problems was the emotional exhaustion. Lucia lived on constant alert, as if she were always on the verge of an attack. She slept only a few hours a night, woke up startled by the slightest noise, and sometimes cried in the dark, muffling the sound so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Physical exhaustion compounded an isolation that seemed to grow with each passing day. Close friends had already drifted away, tired of hearing about investigations, maps, and white vans. Even her own family began to shun her. Her mother told her she needed to let God take care of things, and her brother made no secret of his irritation, claiming she was wasting her life chasing ghosts. The marriage, already hanging by a thread, fell apart completely. Her husband, Javier, couldn't bear the intensity of Lucia's obsession. He said he, too, suffered for his daughter, but needed to move on. For him, continuing to investigate was prolonging an unbearable pain. For her, giving up was tantamount to killing Camilla a second time. The clash was inevitable. He packed his bags and left, leaving only a cold note on the table. "I can't live like this anymore." Lucia read those words so many times that she ended up tearing the paper to shreds, but each sentence remained engraved like an echo that would never leave her. Alone at home, surrounded by photos of missing children and red lines connecting dates and places, Lucia began to feel the weight of carrying everything on her shoulders. Her body begged for rest, but her mind wouldn't stop. When she closed her eyes, she saw Camilla's smiling face, and that kept her from giving up. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in like poison. Was she really doing the right thing? Was she losing her sanity? Gradually, this loneliness became part of her life. Lucia began talking to herself, as if she needed to hear her own voice to keep from going mad. Some days, she walked the streets with a photo of her daughter in her hands, showing it to strangers, asking if they'd seen that little girl. Some looked at her with pity, others just looked away. Most already knew her story, but no one knew how to help. She was the mother who couldn't get over it, and that label hurt her more than anything else. Yet no matter how deep she sank, something inside her wouldn't let her stop. Lucia carried with her an almost irrational certainty that she was close to something big. The feeling of being on the right path was so strong that it overcame despair, pain, hunger, and even loneliness. She knew that every detail she uncovered, no matter how small, brought her closer to the truth. The price she was paying was high, but nothing compared to the thought of abandoning her daughter to oblivion. And it was in this state of absolute exhaustion, with her body frail and her mind exhausted, that Lucia found the strength to take another step. A step that would take her straight to the heart of what she was trying to reveal. Because without realizing it, all the suffering she was experiencing was not only an obstacle, it was also a harbinger that the truth was closer than ever. And what she didn't yet know was that soon she would face the person behind that nightmare. Lucia never forgot the day she first heard the name that would change the course of her investigation. Until then, all she had were loose clues, witness accounts, maps covered in red marks, and the clear pattern of the white van that appeared in practically every disappearance. But what was missing was the face behind it all, someone to give form to the monstrosity that had been haunting Puebla and other neighboring cities. It was on a muggy afternoon in February 2017 that this void began to be filled. She was in a downtown cafe, reviewing notes when a man approached. He was a cleaner from one of the city's warehouses, a simple, nervous man who constantly glanced around. He said he knew who was involved in the kidnappings, but was afraid to say anything. Lucia, accustomed to false leads, remained calm and asked him to get straight to the point. Then the name came out of her mouth like a punch, Ernesto Salgado. The shock was immediate. Ernesto was a well-known local businessman, owner of a chain of warehouses and storage facilities that employed dozens of people. He appeared at charity events, sponsored children's soccer teams, and had influential friends in politics. For many, he was a model of success. For Lucia, the revelation sounded too impossible to be true. But the more the man spoke, the more it all fell into place. He said he had seen the white van parked next to one of Ernesto's warehouses on more than one occasion, always at night, always at odd hours. And most disturbingly, he claimed to have heard muffled cries coming from inside the warehouse, although he never had the courage to take a closer look. Lucia left with her heart racing. For the first time, it wasn't just a suspicion or a coincidence. There was a name, a face. She decided to investigate further who Ernesto Salgado was. She combed through public records, photos of events, and even found old newspaper interviews with him. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that this man was the missing piece of the puzzle. And what tormented her most was precisely the contrast. Ernesto was seen as a kind, polite man, always smiling in front of the cameras, offering donations to hospitals and schools. But behind this image lay hints of something much darker. Former employees, when discreetly approached by Lucia, spoke of his explosive temper behind the scenes, the controlling way he ran the business, and his strange habit of disappearing for hours, sometimes days, without explaining why. Lucia also discovered that Ernesto had connections with people outside Mexico, shady businessmen who invested in her warehouses without ever appearing publicly. This further raised her alarm. Was she facing an internationally organized network? Was Ernesto merely playing a role in something much larger? The idea was terrifying, but every detail reinforced the same conclusion. He was not only a respected businessman, but also the face of a predator hiding behind a veneer of kindness. His image at children's events began to haunt Lucia. Photographs of him smiling alongside children, holding championship trophies or delivering food baskets, now seemed to carry a disturbing double meaning. She remembered running into him at one of these events years earlier, shortly before Camilla's disappearance. The memory made her shudder. Could her daughter have been in his plans even then? The scariest thing was realizing how everything fit with the pattern she had been studying. Ernesto's warehouses were right next to the routes Lucia had marked on her map. It was as if he had strategically chosen his locations, taking advantage of everyone's trust in him. The white van, which appeared in so many witnesses, could very well be part of his fleet of vehicles used for transporting goods. The symbol described by Mateo, which so intrigued Lucia, was strangely reminiscent of the logo of one of the companies linked to Ernesto's group. The portrait that emerged before her was terrifying, a man unremarkable in the eyes of society, but monstrous behind the scenes. A predator hiding beneath the guise of a benefactor, someone capable of manipulating authorities, gaining public trust, and, at the same time, maintaining a cruel child abduction scheme. That night, Lucia returned home and pasted a printed photo of Ernesto Salgado on the wall. She stared at that smiling face for hours, trying to find some trace that would reveal the monster behind the mask. She felt anger, disgust, and fear, but above all, she felt closer than ever to the truth. And it was at that moment that he realized something even more disturbing. If Ernesto really was behind it all, he wasn't just a businessman with a dirty secret. He was someone protected, someone who knew how to cover his tracks, someone with allies willing to silence anyone who got too close. And Lucia, alone, without support, was about to put her finger right on the wound. The risk was enormous, but she had no other choice, because deep down something told her that the closer she got to Ernesto's face, the closer she got to answers about her daughter Camilla. And the only question hammering at her mind was, how far would he be willing to go to keep the secret buried? January 2017 marked one of the most painful moments in Lucia's life, a personal blow that knocked her off balance in a way she hadn't even believed possible. It wasn't enough to live daily with the absence of Camilla, her daughter who had disappeared years before. Now the pain was cruelly repeated within her own family. Valentina, her 12-year-old niece, disappeared after leaving school. It was a seemingly normal afternoon, full of routine and the sound of children running through the hallways. But in a matter of minutes, everyone's lives changed. Valentina was a cheerful, talkative girl who loved to draw and always said she wanted to be an artist. She was in 6th grade and, like any other day, called her mother to say she was on her way home. She never arrived. Security cameras showed the last few minutes. Valentina was walking calmly, backpack on, when a white van, exactly like the one already linked to other disappearances, appeared in the background. The vehicle stopped a few meters ahead. The girl disappeared from the footage, and from then on, nothing more. When Lucia received the news, the ground seemed to disappear. She felt trapped in an endless cycle of horror. Her sister, Valentina's mother, collapsed in her arms, and it was at that moment that reality hit her hard. This wasn't just a distant investigation, something she was doing on behalf of other families. The nightmare had entered her own home, affecting yet another beloved child. The outrage was immediate. Lucia rushed to the scene, tried to speak to the police, and begged for swift action. But, as always, the authorities' slowness was repeated. They filed a report, made some notes, and promised to investigate. To Lucia, it seemed like a bad joke. She knew exactly what it meant. Another child would be lost in the black hole of bureaucracy. The emotional impact was devastating. The family, already divided by Lucia's approach to her search, now fractured even further. Some blamed her, saying her obsession had brought evil closer to them, as if investigating too much had provoked the wrath of dangerous people. Others accused her of using her niece's disappearance to fuel her own personal crusade. All of this weighed on her shoulders like heavy stones, but at the same time, it strengthened the conviction that she was facing something real, something concrete, and that now had a name and a face. Ernesto Salgado. Lucia spent sleepless nights reviewing the camera footage, zooming in on each frame, searching for details the police hadn't even considered. She believed that this disappearance could be the key to finally proving what she'd been saying for years. If she could directly link Valentina to the scheme she'd been investigating, no one could ignore it any longer. But at the same time, despair weighed heavily on her. What if she was right? And if it really was the same network, what would happen to her niece? It was like experiencing torture in real time. On one side, the desperate hope of finding Valentina alive. On the other, the fear that she was now suffering the same grim fate as so many other children. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. And in the midst of this agony, Lucia knew she couldn't stop. Her niece's disappearance not only increased her pain, but also brought her closer to the truth. And it was precisely this new loss that ignited an even greater fury within her. It wasn't just for Camilla anymore, not just for the 80 children she suspected were hidden somewhere. Now it was also for Valentina. With each tear, each sleepless night, Lucia grew certain that she wouldn't rest until she'd extracted the truth from wherever it was hidden. Because, deep down, something told her that this personal blow was no coincidence, but rather a direct response to everything she'd been discovering. And that only made her wonder, how far would Ernesto be willing to go to silence her? Lucia was no longer just a mother searching for her daughter. After Valentina's disappearance, her investigation took on a desperate, almost feverish tone. She knew she needed to speed up, that every minute could mean the difference between saving or losing her niece. It was in this state that she plunged into an even more intense search, a race against time in which her body could no longer keep up with her mind. He spent entire days in front of the connection board that took up almost the entire living room wall. He enlarged the map, added new lines and symbols, retraced routes, and crossed dates. He began using coded folders to organize details, disappearance locations, suspicious vehicles, schedules, even the names of people who might be connected to the network. He didn't allow himself to rest. When his body collapsed, he would sleep for a few hours on the couch, pen still in hand, and his eyes fixed on the children's photos. But it wasn't just paper and ink. Lucia began walking the streets, searching for any sign that might have gone unnoticed. She revisited every corner, chatted with shopkeepers, asked drivers if they'd seen anything. She spent hours analyzing old security cameras, asking acquaintances for favors to obtain copies that would never be officially released. her notebook filled with precise times, vans passing by a school at 7:15 a.m., a warehouse opening at midnight, a suspicious shipment arriving unregistered. She even infiltrated dangerous areas, following clues that some children might have been taken to abandoned houses on the outskirts. She entered alone, with a flashlight and a racing heart, knowing that at any moment she might encounter something she couldn't handle. She found old mattresses, broken toys, children's clothes discarded on the floor. No concrete sign of the children, but the suffocating feeling that they had passed through there. These discoveries shook her deeply, but also confirmed that she was on the right path. Desperation grew with each passing day. Lucia didn't just want proof, she wanted answers. And more than ever, she wanted to find Valentina before it was too late. At times, she would pick up her cell phone and almost call the FBI or an international reporter, but she always hesitated. He didn't have enough evidence to support the case against Ernesto, and one wrong move could mean losing everything. She had to be careful, but her heart wouldn't allow her to calm down. It was as if she were fighting two enemies at once, the relentless passage of time and the deafening silence of the authorities who refused to act. This combination brought her to the brink of collapse. She cried as she walked the streets, screamed to herself in the car, but soon returned to taking notes, investigating, moving forward. There was no longer room for doubt. Valentina needed to be found, and that meant she would have to dig deeper than ever, even if it cost her own safety. And it was precisely in this state of desperate searching, with her mind torn between pain and hope, that Lucia began to realize she was getting dangerously close to something too big. Each new clue, each detail she gathered, brought her closer not only to the truth, but also to the people who wanted to keep this secret buried. And the question that wouldn't leave her mind was, how far would she be willing to go before they stopped her? Lucia believed that, after everything she had gathered, the police could no longer ignore her. She was convinced that with the new information about Valentina, the overlapping schedules, witness accounts, and even the old camera footage, she would finally be heard. But when she decided to hand over this material, what she received was once again silence and contempt. She was called to the police station, hopeful, but soon realized that nothing had changed. The investigator who greeted her hurriedly flipped through a few pages, let out an impatient sigh, and said the information was inconclusive. With every word he said, Lucia felt her blood boil. She persisted, explaining how the white van had appeared in several cases, showing the dates that coincided with local events, telling her about Ernesto's warehouses and the suspicious connections to shell companies. The officer listened for a few minutes and then uttered the sentence that made her shudder. "Ms. Ramirez, perhaps you should stop. You're going too far." It wasn't just discrediting, it was a warning. A clear warning that tampering with the situation was not welcome. She left with tears in her eyes, but her mind filled with anger. It was no longer just incompetence or neglect. Now it seemed like a deliberate barrier, an attempt to bury the truth at any cost. The more she persisted, the more she realized she was fighting not only against criminals hiding in the shadows, but also against the very system that was supposed to protect children. It was as if there were an invisible force protecting powerful people who had a vested interest in keeping everything hidden. Frustration took over. Lucia spent sleepless nights staring at the wall of photos and notes, wondering if it still made sense to continue. She was exhausted, alone, without support, and increasingly at risk. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered Camilla's smile and Valentina's look at the last family party. That memory was enough to rekindle the flame that the authorities' contempt tried to extinguish. Pain mixed with anger. It was inconceivable to accept that the lives of so many children were being treated as disposable statistics. And most disturbing was the feeling that she was closer to the truth than ever. If they were trying to silence her, it was because there was indeed something big behind it. The police's refusal wasn't just disinterest, it was a sign that they were touching on deep wounds, on secrets that needed to remain hidden. Deep down, Lucia knew this was the most dangerous moment of her journey. The isolation was total, and her trust in any authority had dissolved. She felt trapped, but also determined as never before, and just when she thought she was about to crumble, when it seemed there was no way out, an unexpected force would appear in her path, an alliance that would change everything. Lucia was exhausted, consumed by the weight of the investigation, the pain of so many losses, and the constant disdain from the authorities. But it was at that moment, when she thought she was completely alone, that something unexpected happened. A phone call changed the course of her struggle. It was a man's voice, firm but calm. He introduced himself as Michael Torres, an FBI agent working on international human trafficking cases. He said he had been monitoring disappearances in Mexico for some time, and that Ernesto Salgado's name had already appeared in reports that had never been made public. At first, Lucia was suspicious. How many times had she heard empty promises? How many people had approached her simply out of curiosity or sensationalism? But there was something in Michael's tone that conveyed sincerity. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Lucia arrived first, as she always did, observing every detail of the place to ensure it wasn't a trap. When Michael entered, she realized he wasn't just another bureaucrat. His gaze bore the same weariness as hers, the weight of someone who had seen too much and knew the cost of silence from the authorities. He placed a thick folder on the table and bluntly said, "You were right all along." Inside the folder were documents proving suspicious financial transactions linked to Ernesto Salgado. Large transfers to offshore accounts, shell companies set up in tax havens, and even international transport records unavailable in any official system. For Michael, it was clear. Ernesto wasn't just a businessman involved in something shady. He was part of a much larger network with connections that spanned borders. Lucia listened to every word with her heart racing. Finally, someone validated everything she'd been saying for years. But at the same time, her fear grew. If even the FBI had trouble exposing Ernesto, what did that say about the scale of the network? Michael confirmed her suspicions. Influential figures, politicians, business people, and even local agents were involved. Any rash move could put more children's lives at risk, and Lucia's too. Still, the unexpected alliance brought her a relief she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she wasn't completely alone. Someone believed in her. Someone had access to information and resources that could make a difference. Michael proposed they work together, exchanging information, crossing paths, to build a dossier robust enough to justify an official operation. Lucia accepted without hesitation. She knew this was the opportunity she'd been waiting for. From then on, lonely nights gave way to discreet meetings, where she showed off her maps and notes, while Michael brought her information from international investigations. It was like piecing together two halves of the same story. Each conversation revealed more about the network that kept the missing children hidden, and each discovery heightened the tension. Confidence grew, but along with it came a sense of imminent danger. Now they weren't just loose clues. Now there was concrete evidence, real connections, evidence that could bring down Ernesto and the entire scheme. And Lucia knew that the closer they got to the truth, the greater the risk of someone catching on. At that moment, everything indicated that the end of the mystery was near. But it was also becoming increasingly clear that the price of revealing the truth would be extremely high, because alongside Michael, Lucia finally understood that she was facing something much greater than she had expected, and that at any moment the fragile thread holding together her search could snap brutally. In the early hours of March 14th, 2017, Lucia could barely sleep. Her encounter with Michael Torres had confirmed everything she'd already suspected. But now it wasn't just a matter of piecing things together. It was time to act. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Michael had warned her that the operation would take place that morning, in conjunction with Mexican federal forces, and that she couldn't be present. But it was impossible to ask a mother to stay home while dozens of children, perhaps even her own niece, were just meters away from being saved. Lucia knew she was taking risks, but decided to watch from afar, hidden, as if watching her own fate. The target was one of Ernesto Salgado's warehouses, located in a remote area of Puebla. At first glance, it looked like just another warehouse, with high gates and sheds surrounded by concrete walls. Nothing stood out, but behind that unremarkable facade lay something no one would have guessed. Unmarked black cars began arriving discreetly, followed by military trucks. Armed police officers stood silently, awaiting the final command. The atmosphere was one of absolute suspense, the kind of silence that precedes explosions. At 6:12 a.m., the main gate was broken down. The force of the blow echoed through the air like a thunderous crash that signaled the start of the operation. Shouts in Spanish mingled with the sound of boots running across the yard. Warehouses were invaded, doors kicked in, lights hurriedly turned on. For a few minutes, it seemed nothing would be found. Boxes, shelves, rusty tools, a common, almost disappointing scene. Until one of the agents, stomping his foot against the concrete floor, heard a hollow sound. It was there. Beneath a stack of heavy crates, leaning against the end of the warehouse, was a hidden hatch. Everyone's heart raced. One of the soldiers removed the crates, another pulled back the iron lid. The smell that came from within was enough to confirm that something terrible was about to be revealed. The staircase led to a cold, stuffy underground corridor. Dim lights flickered on the sides, illuminating a space that resembled a makeshift maze. And then the seemingly impossible happened. In the first room, they found children huddled against the walls, their clothes torn, their eyes wide, and their faces etched with fear. An eerie silence fell for a few seconds, until one of the girls began to cry softly, breaking the tension and triggering a collective sob. The officers were overcome with emotion. Some removed their helmets and quickly began to remove the children. But what shocked the entire world was the number. 1, 2, 5, 10. Each new door opened revealed more small, fragile bodies hidden on dirty mattresses, all crammed together in inhumane conditions. In the end, there were 80 children who, until then, were just faces on forgotten posters, were now alive, breathing, albeit deeply traumatized. Lucia, from afar, saw the first rescue vehicles arriving, sirens blaring. She knew she couldn't get any closer, but when she saw the little ones being carried in the arms of firefighters and police officers, her heart nearly leaped into her throat. She cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. It wasn't just relief, it was confirmation that all those years of struggle, isolation and pain had not been in vain. He still didn't know if among those frightened faces would be Valentina's or even a clue to Camilla. But one thing was certain, the secret had been discovered, and nothing would ever be the same again, because from that moment on, the whole world knew of the Puebla underground. And what came next would bring even more revelations that no one was prepared to hear. The hours following the rescue were a whirlwind of emotions that no one in Puebla, not even the world, would forget. The children were removed one by one, some in the arms of firefighters, others walking with frantic steps, still confused about what was happening. The sound of helicopters circling overhead mingled with the desperate cries of mothers and fathers running toward ambulances, begging to know if their children were among the survivors. The scene was chaotic, but charged with a unique energy, the catharsis of families who had lost hope and now, suddenly, had before them the possibility of reunion. Lucia watched from afar, her hands trembling and her eyes brimming with tears. Her heart pounded with each new face that emerged from the depths of that warehouse. It was impossible not to be moved by the sight of mothers collapsing to the floor in tears, fathers hugging their children so tightly they seemed afraid they would disappear again. The sound of sirens, screams, cameras flashing non-stop, everything blended into an atmosphere charged with pain and hope, and amidst the chaos, Valentina's image emerged. She was alive, frightened, thin, with a lost look in her eyes, but alive. When Lucia saw her, it was as if the whole world had stopped for a second. He ran to her, ignoring the shouts of officers trying to contain the crowd, and hugged her as if he would never let go. Their tears mingled with the noise around them, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. It was the reunion Lucia had never imagined possible, the moment when all her struggle, all the sleepless nights, all the authorities' contempt made sense. But along with the joy, there was also an emptiness. As she held Valentina close to her chest, Lucia couldn't help but think of Camilla. She looked at each rescued child, hoping to see her there, but her face was nowhere to be seen. It was a cruel mix of victory and defeat, of joy and pain. She had managed to save so many children, she had managed to bring her niece back, but her daughter was still missing, lost somewhere she hadn't yet discovered. The outcome was emotional for everyone. Families gathered, some in tears of joy, others still awaiting news, experiencing the anguish of not finding their son among those rescued. Journalists broadcast live to the entire world, calling the case the largest child rescue in recent history. But for Lucia, there were no cameras, no headlines that mattered. There was only that embrace, the bittersweet feeling of victory and the permanent scar of knowing there were still unanswered questions. And as night fell over Puebla, the city illuminated by vehicle lights and incessant flashes, Lucia fell silent. She knew she would never be the same after that day. She had been recognized as the woman who never gave up, the mother who faced everything and everyone, but who also bore scars that would never disappear. Because, even amid the collective euphoria, a shadow still haunted her. The certainty that Ernesto Salgado did not act alone, and that the story, however unbelievable, was not yet over. The morning after the rescue, as the first rays of sunlight illuminated Puebla, the city seemed to have changed forever. The streets were packed with journalists, cameras and reporters from different countries trying to capture every detail, every face, every tear. The whole world was looking at that small dot on the map of Mexico, now forever marked by one of the largest child rescues ever recorded. But behind the headlines and the collective relief, there was something no one could ignore: the scars left on each of those lives. Lucia, who until then had been seen by many as the obsessed woman, was finally recognized as the unbroken thread of hope. People who had previously called her crazy now applauded her, thanked her, and looked at her with admiration. But she herself didn't know how to deal with this new reality, because despite having helped expose Ernesto Salgado's secret and having seen dozens of families reunited, her heart remained incomplete. Valentina was safe, yes, but Camilla was still a screaming void. Her niece's embrace brought comfort, but it also reinforced the pain of her daughter's absence. In the days that followed, Lucia was called for interviews, honored, and even hailed as a hero in international headlines. But when the cameras faded and the roar of the Bo crowd died down, she found herself alone in silence, facing the memories of everything she had experienced. Her life would never return to normal. The trauma, the exhaustion, the weight of everything she had seen underground were not things that could simply disappear. The scars were invisible, but too deep to ignore. Still, there was something greater than her suffering itself. There was a sense that, despite her loss, her persistence had saved lives. Lucia couldn't rescue her daughter, but she gave dozens of other mothers the chance to embrace their own, and that somehow kept her going, not as a complete victory, but as proof that fighting, even when all seems lost, can still change destinies. And that was how the story closed before the eyes of the world, a collective catharsis of pain, hope, and justice. The Puebla underground ceased to be just a dark hideout and became a symbol of resistance, reminding everyone that evil can hide behind masks of kindness, but that the truth, sooner or later, finds a way to surface. Lucia, now more silent than ever, knew this was not just a story of rescue. It was also a permanent reminder that some ghosts never leave, and that, behind the tears of relief, there still lay a greater mystery, waiting to be revealed.